So good evening, everyone. Pleasure to see you all at this late hour. My task tonight is very simple, and I'll be short. You know that our BEEPA seminars are a great opportunity to hear interesting speakers who have the opportunity of addressing the kind of issues that we spend our time discussing in classrooms. Speaker tonight has, let's say, many titles to fame in that he has been and is at the same time a very successful entrepreneur in the world of cybersecurity, but also a very active participant in important debates, not only over cybersecurity, but also over geopolitical issues. And he has contributed in multiple ways to those debates, not only by putting together his own contributions, but equally importantly, by making it possible for others to do so in establishing, for instance, a think tank that develops important analyses over the issues I mentioned, and also in sponsoring generously a center established at Johns Hopkins SAIS in DC. So in all these capacities, it is for us a privilege to host him tonight. I must say I very much look forward to our discussion, but I will yield to my dear colleague Sergei Radchenko to present tonight's talk. And again, I thank you for having joined us and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Reno. So I thought about, instead of having a lecture, to structure this in a different way and allow a maximum possible time for discussion, because we can have a wide-ranging discussions on the issues that DMITRI, you and I are interested in, and everybody else here is interested in, because those are issues that define the present age. So let me begin, first of all, by mentioning this book. It's right here. And we are talking about the book, among other things, today, World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for 21st Century. DMITRI, first question. When I wrote my first book, it was pretty, and had it published, it was clear why I did it. And, to disappoint everybody, it's not for intellectual curiosity or anything like that. It was to get a job in the academic world. You have to publish a book. So I did. In your case, it's not something you see every day. Successful tech entrepreneurs writing books about geopolitics. I mean, it doesn't really happen all the time, if you know what I mean. So could you maybe explain, first of all, how you came to this idea of writing this book?
Well, I'm looking for a job. No, so I began writing this book right after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And as you know, Sergei, I was one of the early folks that said very publicly, with a great deal of certainty, that this was going to take place back in December of 2021.
DMITRI, what's shocking is you did it without access, presumably, to the classified information. Which is remarkable. Because few people were willing to stick their heads out or necks out like this, right? To make a poll. I certainly didn't. I'm much too careful, right, on this issue. So I'm not gonna make. I'm not gonna make.
Oh, maybe I'm not as careful.
You did, but you got it right. But I was impressed. There was a very long list. I like how you went into this analysis of why Putin would do that, and obviously you proved on target.
Well, and I think, and hopefully we'll get into some of this discussion, I think in the realm of international relations, we don't spend enough time trying to understand people and personalities, their psychologies. I think way too much focus is spent on ideology and things that are actually not deep convictions, I think, for most people, including leaders in both authoritarian democratic states. But I became convinced of that. But you know, Sergey, as much as I was convinced it was going to happen, and I was certain it would happen that winter, and certainly early on I became convinced of that. But by the time that we were in late February, I was expecting it to happen at any moment. I actually thought it would happen earlier than it did because I was at the Munich Security Conference the weekend before the war. And if you recall, Zelensky famously flew in to give a talk, and I was certain that Putin would surely not allow him to come back, that he would invade. In retrospect, that probably would have been smart for him had he done that and prevented Zelensky from getting back into the country and rallying his people. But you know, when the war did break out that Wednesday night in Washington, D.C., Thursday morning here in Europe, it was still a shock to the system. You know, when you expect something to happen, but it happens, you're sort of like, oh my God, you know, this is unbelievable, right? That this has actually took place. And as I was doing a retrospective on what I got right and what I got wrong, because I certainly didn't get everything right in that analysis, I realized that the causes that drove, I think, Putin to invade were actually the same causes that I think are playing out in the Indo-Pacific, causing Xi to want to take Taiwan in the next 4 to 8 years. And it was striking to me how few people are focused on that issue, very similarly to how few people at the time I started writing, certainly back in December, about this possibility, were focused on this coming war. And unlike Ukraine, where you really didn't have time, I think Putin made up his mind, certainly by late 2021, and there was very little we could have done to dissuade him. I do think that there is time with China, and that war, should it take place over Taiwan, would be even more catastrophic, orders of magnitude more catastrophic than the war that you're seeing play out in Europe today. And the goal of the book was really to try to educate, not necessarily policymakers, but the American public. And my co-author and I, Garrett, wrote this, I think, in a very approachable way, or at least tried to. And I'm spending a lot of time right now going around the country, going around the world, indeed, to talk to not just, you know, people in power. I certainly do my share of that, but more importantly, regular people who are not focused on this at all, and getting really shocking responses, or people being shocked, I should say, in response to this book, because no one, you know, in Middle America is thinking about this issue, and I think they should be.
So let me ask you this then. In the book, I think early on, you say something that I found extremely interesting. People can hear. They don't have to.
Well, you have Zoom too.
I thought it was very interesting to, and we've discussed this issue, but I wonder if you can go over some of the same ground. The issue of our general relationship with China. You basically say that we are already in a Cold War with China. And what is striking, I think in the beginning, you talk about, you know, when exactly this happened. You highlight a moment you thought that in retrospect was the evidence that showed that we are already in the Cold War with China. I mean, I find it really interesting. As a Cold War historian myself, I find it really, really interesting.
Cold War I historian.
Cold War I historian. Oh, that's okay. If we go back to, let's say, 44, 45, nobody thought that we would be in a Cold War. Who was thinking would be in a Cold War? You know, we still had great power cooperation, and then kind of gradually you end up probably much faster than what we are seeing today with China. But certainly by 1947 or by 1949, clearly we were in a Cold War, right? But it was a slide, it was a gradual slide, but it is probably fair to say that only in retrospect could we say that, you know, this is when it started. Yep. And still, I think now we're debating when it really started. What makes you think that the Cold War with China has already started?
Great question. Well, first of all, I'll just quote Deng Xiaoping from 1989, who said at the time that he feared that one Cold War was ending and a second one was beginning. A Cold War against socialism and capitalism, I mean, socialism and communism by capitalist countries, you know, meaning that America and its Western allies were intent to destroy socialist systems, as he was seeing happen both in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So that was 1989 from the leader of China. I I also find it peculiar that the key guidance that everyone is aware of that Deng Xiaoping had given to his people of hide your strength and buy your time did not really get any thought in the West in terms of who are you hiding your strength from and what are you buying your time for? No one seemed to have ever asked that question, which in retrospect seemed to be very obvious. Look, and there's a lot of history in this book, and I have you to thank for really terrific contributions in terms of the conversations we've had throughout the process of writing it. But I came into this book convinced that we're in a Cold War II with China that is very different from the first Cold War. And I came out of it doing a lot of deep research on the first Cold War and the nature of the US-China relationship today, convinced that it's actually almost identical conflicts. And when you go through the litany of similarities, I find it really puzzling that anyone at all would even argue that this is not a new Cold War, right? It starts with a global competition for supremacy that is playing out between the United States and China in every single corner of the world, right? It's not just in the region. It's not just, in Europe or Asia or Africa, Latin America. It's everywhere. It's playing out in the economic sphere. You saw the European Union just in the last month institute tariffs on Chinese EVs and battery technology. It's playing out in the tech sphere with attempts to limit U.S. technology from going to China and retaliations from Chinese companies. It's playing out in the military sphere, right? You have two countries in an arms race right now, both a conventional arms race with huge military buildups that the Chinese have been focused on for decades, and the U.S. is now catching up and investing heavily in the region, and a nuclear arms race, right? China right now, as we speak, is building up massively its nuclear arsenal, going from a stable number of about 300 warheads that they've had for decades since they built up that arsenal in 1964, or started building in 1964, to now trying to, the U.S. intelligence community believes, achieve parity with the United States and get to roughly the same number, 1,500 or so warheads by the mid-century, and about 1,000 by the end, sorry, not mid-century, mid next decade, and about 1,000 by the end of this decade. You have a space race, right? The defining moment, the 1960s, the race to the moon. What do we do now? We're trying to race back to the moon and do so before the Chinese, and perhaps go on to Mars from there. You have a spy war. The director of the FBI in the United States says that the level of espionage from China against our country, against the United States, is the highest it's ever been in any moment of the United States history, including during the first Cold War, because in part enabled by China, by cyber. Sorry, I'm a little jet lagged. I just got off a plane, so forgive me for that. You have, by the way, just recently, if you're reading the headlines, an incredible espionage case that just been announced with literally in the last few weeks, where the Chinese intelligence services or the military have penetrated major telecommunications providers in the United States, AT&T, Verizon, and others, and use that. It just came out literally in the last 24 hours to, in part, tap phone calls between former President Trump and people he was calling, as well as aides to Kamala Harris, right? So really unbelievable level of penetration that's taken place. And this has been going for decades in terms of overall theft of intellectual property that the Chinese have been engaged in. You have a scramble for military bases in the region, right? You have the United States building up its capabilities in Guam and Japan for the first time in 32 years, going into the Philippines and getting access to their military bases. China is doing the same thing in Cambodia and Pakistan and Djibouti. It's trying to establish close relationships with the Pacific Islands nations like Solomon Islands and others. There are security relationships there. So, I'm probably forgetting a few in this litany of reasons, but you look at all that and you say, how can this possibly not be Cold War? And the two sort of factors that you see on the other side of this ledger is that, one, no one wants to acknowledge it, like you said. In 1947, both countries were talking about being in Cold War. Today, you have
it has to be said, the Soviets never really recognized. They always called it a so-called Cold War, i.e., they saw it as an American invention.
Well, you know it much better. So I always appreciate your corrections on the first Cold War, but certainly America was
The Americans,
acknowledging it,
absolutely,
and
absolutely.
today they're refusing to do so. Although recently, as you know, I was at a conference with some former officials arguing about this point, and the counter argument that was used to my strong argument that this is a new Cold War is, well, we should discuss whether we want to call a spade a spade. To which my response is, well, I guess you're willing to acknowledge that it's a spade. And then the second argument that's used is, well, we have this great economic relationship with China, $600 billion of common trade, so it can't possibly be a Cold War. And just on the surface, I find it puzzling when you have a dozen or so similarities and you give me one reason on this other side of the ledger, and you're trying to say that this outweighs all the others. But even if I were to accept that, a couple of things about that. One, it is being severely constrained right now with trade wars that are taking place, and that were started by President Trump, continue under President Biden, escalating in terms of tariffs and export control measures and so forth, and partial decoupling or de-risking, however you want to call it, that's in progress. But two, it also is ahistorical because typically this argument is used by people that they're suggesting that the Soviet economy was completely disconnected from the American economy. And as you've helped me figure out in doing research for this book, there were deep interconnections between the two systems. You had the Ford Motor Company that came into the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s to build tractors, to build the gas factory that produced the Volga limousines that the Soviet leaders would build. Being here in Italy, I can't not mention Fiat coming into the Soviet Union in 1965 to build the famous Lada factories in Tolyatti in Russia, southern Russia, to produce automobiles. You had lots of loans that were being made by Western banks to Warsaw Pact countries that literally sustained their economy. You had the entire oil and gas industry running on Western technologies that were exporting oil from the 1960s on to the West. So certainly not the same level by dollar amount of trade that exists between U.S. and China today, but the similarities are unmistakable.
So on this, I mean, this is super, super interesting. And Dmitry, you know that I'm basically on the same page with you, and it's the two of us and Neil Ferguson, basically, who think that, and everybody else thinks that we're crazy. Steve Kotkin, okay, maybe we're the same. Maybe Hal Brands as well. But the arguments, and I can hear you arguing.
And Henry Kissinger was saying before he passed that we're in the foothills.
Well, there we go. There we go. But let me challenge you, sort of push you a little bit further on this. Not because I don't agree with you, because I do agree with you, but I think we need to really flesh it out a little bit better. So on the question of economics, I think you're right. And I'm discovering that I've discovered from my own previous work. I haven't paid enough attention to economics. Now that I'm looking at economics, I realize how important it was for the Cold War. And there was, as you say, by the 1960s, 1970s, there's basically the West was keeping the Soviet Empire afloat, frankly, through the loans. I mean, it's incredible. It's incredible. You look at it.
We were paying for the arms race for them to arm themselves.
I mean, this is incredible. You look at it, you realize, wow, how can it be that the Western banks were actually paying to this Eastern European country to keep them afloat? And then, of course...
And by the way, we're doing the same thing now with Russia.
With who?
With Russia. Oh, well, but buying oil and gas.
Exactly. Well, that's a slightly different story. But the issue with the Soviets, and this is where it's different from present, is that there was a massive Soviet dependence on the West, especially by the 70s. Massive dependence in terms of hard currency earnings, technologies, everything. But this was not true the other way around, except for once they built the pipelines to Germany, West Germany kind of took some of that energy. But for the United States, the Soviet Union was minuscule. It didn't matter. It was not on that map in terms of its economic influence. Today, China, one of the reasons people keep talking about China, trying to be careful with China, is that you think, okay, well, you pull the plug on our economic relationship, or decouple, whatever, and then basically what happens, you shoot yourself in the head because your own economic situation worsens as a result. So that's one counterexample. I wonder if you can address that. But there's another one that's, I think, deeper. And again, this is, so the economics is one, just, take note of that because I want to hear your view on this. And the second, so dependence versus interdependent. The second is, of course, something you haven't touched on, and this is very interesting, but this is where 99% of historians minus Kotkin, although Kotkin also stresses the role of ideology in his Stalin book, but you would generally say, historians will say, well, wait a second, the Cold War was the Cold War because the Soviet threat was not just a geopolitical threat, it also, they were eating away at the foundations of our society, sort of like in Dr. Strangelove. Remember, what's his name? The general. There's liquid in our precious bodily fluids are being destroyed by the communists. And so there was a fifth column, in a sense. In my class, the biographies class, we'll look at Oppenheimer a couple of weeks ago, and it's fascinating. You look at how leftists, a lot of American scientists, where they were contributing to Communist Party causes. It's not even clear, Oppenheimer himself contributed heavily, was never a member of the Communist Party, but there was this remarkable ideological affiliation between, say, a large part of the American society, certainly the scientific community, and the Soviet Union. Today, who in the United States feels any kind of affinity for China? You don't have a lot of people like that. So in other words, there's no real threat, it seems, of a fifth column emerging, and there's no pretense on the part of the government in Beijing that they're trying to spread a universalistic ideology to the entire world. And so a lot of people will say, well, this is the essential difference, and this is what makes it different from the Cold War. What do you say?
Okay, so on economic dependence, you're absolutely right. But we only became massively economically dependent on China relatively recently, in the last 20 years or so, when we let them into WTO and the level of trade between Western world and China just went through the roof, right? Up until then, since 1979, when we opened up trade relations with China, we were investing in China, much as American and European industrialists were investing in the Soviet Union from the 1920s on to simply make money there, right? Now, we were never dumb enough, I guess, in Cold War I to become so dependent on China, on Soviet Union for critical technologies and turn over our security to them as we have with China.
They didn't have any.
Well, there were restrictions throughout the Cold War on export of supercomputers, for example, and other technologies to the Soviet Union. So there was always a focus on allowing some level of trade. You can sell them Pepsi, but you can't sell them anything that helps with their arm program, with their military programs, or with dramatically enhancing their economy. So there was a focus on that was not with China, and that's why we are in a hole that we are today. So it's purely self-made, right? If we had not, for example, let China into WTO in the early 2000s, we'd probably be talking about a very, very different economic relationship between China and the United States than exists today. So it's a problem purely of our own making. On ideology, thank you for reminding me, because that was one of the similarities that I did forget, because I do think that there is an ideological similarity here. Certainly, Xi Jinping is a Marxist-Leninist in a traditional sense of the word. And China is run by the Chinese Communist Party, right? So the ideology is there, but it's not that they're necessarily trying to spread that Marxist-Leninism with Chinese characteristics around the world, but there is an ideological battle that even the Biden administration talks a lot about, that is authoritarianism versus democracy, and they are absolutely trying to prop up authoritarian regimes around the world. When you look at Xi Jinping's recent visit this year to Europe, where did he go? Yes, he went to France. Where did he go from there? He went to Hungary. He went to countries that are of the same authoritarian bent as China. He's helping Russia to prosecute this war in Ukraine. China is setting up schools in Africa to teach surveillance technologies and authoritarian capabilities and ideologies to future African leaders. So they're absolutely spreading it, perhaps not as aggressive as the Soviet Union was, but as you write so eloquently in your own book, To Run the World, ideology was not necessarily a driving factor of the first Cold War. And the first Cold War was not uniform. There were different phases of it. In the earliest phases, you certainly had the ideological component playing perhaps a bigger role, and propaganda and engagement with communist parties around the world than you did in the later stages with Brezhnev and certainly into the Gorbachev era, right? So it's important not to be revisionist in the Cold War I history to think that ideology was a driving focus of it. And I actually agree with your premise, with your thesis on the first Cold War in your book, that it wasn't ideology, but the quest for recognition and respect and power that drove the Soviet Union, much as I think it is driving today China.
Well, and of course I'm going to agree with agree with this, but that is basically my response when people raise this question about ideology. So it's not about, let's not talk about ideology now, but let's go back to the first Cold War and let's talk about ideology and what role it played, because we could actually talk about the Cold War without necessarily thinking that the Soviet Union was out to spread its ideology, because there are other reasons why the Soviets were involved in around the world, and this is geopolitical competition. Doesn't have to be defined in ideological terms.
And by the way, the examples you use with Oppenheimer, you can go to Kim Philby and others that famous cases of people being sympathetic to the Soviet Union or sometimes being recruited spies. Virtually all of those cases happened before 1945, actually.
That's right.
Before you could say that the Cold War even began.
That's right. That's right.
I argue actually in my book that the first Cold War began not in 1945, but in 1920, when the hot war with Russia ended. There was a ill-fated military intervention by Western powers in the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1920. It basically wrapped up by 1920. And I argue that the Soviets focused intently on this competition with bourgeois countries. Now, primarily they were focused on the UK because they viewed it as the main devil. Not much has changed because they still continue to focus on Great Britain as the main enemy even today. But certainly quite a bit of focus on the United States, focus on Germany, etc. That took place during that time. Now, you could argue whether it truly was a Cold War or not, because Soviet Union was not as powerful as it became after World War II. Although even right after World War II, it was not quite powerful. It had a military power, but it did not have any economic power, having been decimated during World War II. So it's an interesting question of when did World War I actually begin? And I argue that this Cold War with China did not begin with the Trump trade war in 2017 and 18. It began much earlier. I just quoted Deng Xiaoping from 1989, but you could go even further back.
So I was recently reading something about from Brezhnev's meetings with Nixon, and one thing that struck me there, which I found really interesting, is that in the early 70s, Brezhnev thought that the Cold War was over. He actually said so. Now we have détente with the United States, so therefore the Cold War is over. And then, of course, things again turned pretty bad in the late 1970s. So you could almost apply the same sort of framework to the relationship with China, and you can actually go back and say, well, look, the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China, going back to 1949, was not exactly a friendly relationship. And we had a period of acute confrontation. You talk about this in the book, the various crises, the Flashpoint, Taiwan Strait crisis. The Americans considered using atomic bombs to bomb the hell out of China on a number of times in the 1950s. In the 1960s, you have this, again, a very, very confrontational relationship.
In the 1990s, you had the third Taiwan Strait crisis, where the Bill Clinton administration was preparing for war with China. People have forgotten that.
So it is interesting because, you look back and you see that there's actually a lot of confrontation in the Sino-American relationship that people kind of wished away for a time, which is now.
Yeah. Well, we actually fought a war with China in the Korean War, right? We never fought a war with the Russians.
Yeah. One issue that I wanted to talk about, you mentioned this, and I promise I'll open the floor up for questions after this, but I wanted to go back to this question of personalities. And DMITRI, we discussed a few days ago this motivations of leaders in power, and that's very interesting. You talk about Putin, maybe you can elucidate this and talk a little bit more about his motivations, but we talked in our conversation, we were talking about Mao. And Mao Zedong is, of course, an interesting historical personality, and historians have been arguing for years and years and years about what actually drove the guy. So we have had people like or Zhang Rong in Chinese, and John Halliday, who argued that Mao was just driven by raw power. But there were others, people like Sean Holmes, who came in writing about the Mao and the Cultural Revolution. McFarquhar, I think, also was in that tradition. That would argue, well, that doesn't explain it all. Surely people are driven by more than a desire for power. Because if you're Mao Zedong in 1966, you're a god. You're a god of that country. I mean, you purged all your potential opponents, and then you still go on and you do all this crazy stuff, like unleash this whole, Red Guard movement and do all, continue this revolution for a few more years. What drives you then? Doesn't make any sense. And I wonder then, if in your view, in your investigations of these leaders and people maybe like Xi Jinping and Putin, you found anything that would suggest to you what they are actually driven by. Is it just power? Is it something else? If this is something else, is it ideology perhaps? I mean, what is it?
It's not ideology. I think that we tend to forget that these people are human, and they have human reactions and human ways of making decisions. And I find it interesting that people try to prescribe monocausal decision-making to a lot of these people, when in your own lives, when you make major decisions, whether it's based on who you choose to marry or buying a house or whatever, it's a complex decision-making, unless you just decide to gamble and marry the first person to meet, right? And what I find is that any leader, by the way, from a democratic country or an authoritarian country, is driven by very similar human emotions. Now, there's a difference how far they're willing to go in the pursuit of those desires, and how many lives they're willing to sacrifice and so forth, but they're driven by ambition, right? They're driven by power. They're driven by ego. Any politician, regardless of whether they're, an authoritarian one or a democratic one, is driven by that. They may be driven by greed. And you look at the corruption that's taking place in China right now, and particularly with Xi Jinping's family, has been covered pretty extensively. Clearly, greed plays a huge role with it. No question, it plays a huge role with Putin. But also, every person thinks about their mortality and leaving something behind, right? So you're thinking about legacy. You're thinking about your place in history. So, when it comes to Mao Zedong, as we talked about, Sergei, yes, in the 1960s, he's achieved his power ambition, but, he did not achieve the greatness in history of wanting to build an incredibly successful country and being responsible for that, right? And he was, I think, driven in many ways by that. And I think Xi Jinping is driven by that. And I think Putin is driven by that, right? So when you look at Putin in particular, the man is probably one of the richest, if not the richest man on the planet, having, so-called wallets everywhere and these palaces and yachts that we've seen from the Navalny investigations over the last few years. So you might ask, well, what does he want? Well, he wants his place in history. He talks openly about admiring Peter the Great, that famously expanded the Russian Empire, built the city of St. Petersburg, where Putin incidentally was born when it was still called Leningrad. So that plays into, I think, this desire to invade Ukraine. And I broke it down in the book to 5 factors that were driving Putin to launch this ruinous war, and I think are driving Xi to invade Taiwan. First of all, a distorted view of history, right? Both of these men are convinced that these places, Ukraine and Taiwan, are not independent nations and don't deserve to be independent nations, that are sort of a fluke of history, that they have their sovereignty, and it is time to change that, right? Putin has talked openly about this for decades, by the way. This did not begin in 2021 when he wrote that terrible dissertation paper on how Ukraine is not a nation. I saw an interview recently that surfaced of him as a small-level bureaucrat in St. Petersburg in 1991, giving an interview to the television station, local television station in St. Petersburg. He was completely unknown at this point, right? Had just gotten out of KGB, was hired by his protege, Sobchak, the mayor of St. Petersburg, to help him in the administration, and is giving this interview lamenting the fall of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, I should say, and how all of these little nation states got created that shouldn't really be nation states, and saying this is a huge tragedy. In 1991, right? This has just happened. He's not even thinking probably about becoming president of Russia, but he's already thinking that this historical mistake is a problem. Second is destiny, and both a view of their personal destinies and their country's destinies. Xi Jinping obviously talks about achieving rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and he, for the first time ever, made it contingent on unification with Taiwan, achieving this great dream. Putin talks about the destiny of Russia and Ukraine being one and the same, but also personal destinies. And I think one of the ways in which people don't fundamentally understand Putin is that at his core, he's effectively a gangster, right? And the way he looks at Ukraine is not just as a property of Russia, but as, I think, his personal property, because I think he does view himself as a new czar of Russia. And I liken his invasion of Ukraine as a gangster, going out with a girl that you think is yours on the town, and seeing that girl start flirting, that lady, with someone else, in this case, NATO, European Union, whatever you want to think that Ukraine was trying to do, is it was trying to get closer to the West. And as a gangster, what do you expect that person to do? You're going to not take it out on the person that they're flirting with if they're too powerful, right? That's too risky, but you're going to take it out on the girl. And that's exactly what this was all about. It wasn't just about attempting to correct history. It was also about punishing Ukraine, right? For how dare you betray me this way? You're mine, and I'm going to show you that you're mine, in a very sort of thuggish way. And that was driving him. And by the way, same with Xi. They've just passed this law saying that anyone that advocates for separatism in Taiwan is a traitor and can be prosecuted in China. So very, very similar view on the self-determination interest of the Taiwanese people. The other two are security and geography. And look, there's this vigorous debate that's taking place of, did NATO expansion cause this war, or did it have absolutely nothing to do with it? As I mentioned before, I don't believe in monocausal decision-making by any human being, and certainly not by leaders taking momentous decisions like launching a war. But I also don't believe that this factor of NATO either had nothing to do with it or had everything to do with it. I think, the truth is somewhere in the middle, that he was concerned about NATO expansion from a security perspective. And the concern was twofold. It was both defensive and offensive. And people often talk about the defensive use case, which is that Russia is always concerned about expansion of another military alliance on its borders. And I think there's some truth to that. Russia does have a history of numerous invasions from Europe, whether it's Hitler, Napoleon, Teutonic Knights, the Poles in the 1920s, you name it. Most of these invasions, actually all of these invasions, taking the path either through Belarus, which now obviously is effectively controlled by Russia, or Ukraine. So, and as those invasions were taking place, because those territories were so huge, those buffer states, effectively, it allowed Russia to mobilize before the invading forces typically reached Moscow. So from that perspective, they've always viewed those countries, I'm not justifying, I'm just saying how they looked at it, as important. But also, obviously, from an offensive perspective, if you want to project power into Eastern Europe and Western Europe, you have to get through those nations. So holding them and having them be at least in your orbit is really, really important. So that geography, that security plays a big role. And the final factor here is ego, right? That I think is driving both these men, having achieved everything that they can possibly achieve within their nation in terms of consolidating power to an enormous extent. I mean, Xi Jinping probably has more power than Mao ever did, except maybe during the Cultural Revolution. Putin certainly is the new czar of Russia. I mean, no one except maybe Stalin, right, in the first Cold War had as much power in the country as Putin does today. So you're thinking about your legacy, you're thinking about what you want to accomplish, and when you start thinking about correcting these mistakes of history, again, quote unquote, mistakes of history, I'm not arguing that they actually are, but that's how they think about them. You not only want to make sure that your countries achieve these objectives, but you want to get credit for them, right? That's why I think he did this invasion when he did, right? He's been in power, for 23 years before he launched this war. Why didn't he try to do this in 2014 when he did a partial invasion? Why didn't he try to do it earlier in 2003 when you had the first Orange Revolution taking place in Kiev? It's because it wasn't urgent back then, right? And I think coming out of COVID in particular, we all saw the memes with the lawn tables, and clearly he's incredibly concerned about his longevity, his health, etc., and probably got him thinking a lot about his own mortality. He was thinking, before I leave either this world or transition power, which I do think he probably was thinking about, because I think he did get bored finally of ruling Russia and the work that goes into it, and was thinking about transitioning until he realized this would be impossible, and certainly probably is impossible now. And picking someone that he would have confidence would preserve his family's wealth and his own life. But he was thinking about, what is it? What kind of world do I want to leave to future generations? And I think he decided that this, again, problem, quote unquote, of Ukraine had to be solved before he left office, right? Which is why he launched this when he did. And I think the same dynamics playing out in the Indo-Pacific, where Xi Jinping is talking about Taiwan as a problem that can be passed on to future generations. Well, the man is 70. By the way, both these men this year were 70. Putin just turned 71 this month. Xi Jinping turned 70 in June. And they're looking at this potentially last decade or so in power, potentially of their lives. Who knows? Xi Jinping does not look to me like the healthiest guy in the world, as an opportunity to get this done, right? And I think that 2028 through 2032 is going to be an incredibly dangerous moment. Why? Because he is up for re-election in 27. He gets a 5-year term as chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, and almost certainly will get reelected unless something truly unexpected happens. That term expires in 2032. He'll be 79 in 2032. As you know, Sergei, in the Chinese communist system, they don't tend to elect their leaders into their 80s. So maybe he gets another 5-year term at that point, but he can't count on that. He can't count on his health. And I think he'll be very much focused on, resolving this problem of Taiwan in that time frame.
So thank you. I appreciate this answer. And just by laying out those factors, you show how nuanced and complex this question is. One thing that I find so frustrating in our debate about whether it's Russia or China is the tendency for people to skip all this nuance and say, well, I know what this is. This is, if you're like Joe Mearsheimer, you'll say, oh, this is, NATO enlargement. This is what caused it. Like, no, that's...
Again,
it's not
humans just don't make decisions like that, right?
It's not.
It's too simplistic.
But then you also have the other, you have the other camp as well, and they'll say, well, this is just, Putin's imperialism. It explains everything. Once you start digging into it, you realize the complexities of these things, and what and as a historian, I find it exceptionally difficult to actually pin it down, because once you start digging into psychology of leaders, you find that there's evidence for almost every explanation possible in the way that they talked about certain things, etc. You can find evidence. If you want to prove whatever you believe about Putin, you can find evidence for it by looking at these various speeches.
Well, and that's why I think it's multi-causal, that all of these elements play a role, that you can't just say that this is the only thing that drives someone on any big life decisions.
No, that's absolutely correct. But also, I, as a historian myself, I have to be humble sometimes and say, well, actually, I don't even know when I do certain things. I don't know why I did them, right? Never mind when Putin does certain things. So yeah, of course, all we can do is we can ask questions, and then we can offer possible explanations of a right.
And this is why I don't buy the ideology argument, because ideology, again, for democratic leaders or authoritarian leaders, is always malleable. And I believe ideology plays a role in justifying what you already want to do in terms of your ambition in power, your ego, your greed, whatever. And, you look at hardcore ideologues, like Lenin, for example, right? The student of Marxist-Leninism, he gets power in the Soviet Union. What does he do? The first thing that he does is abandons it and institutes the new economic program, NEP, which is effectively, a version of capitalism, because he knows that he needs it to actually sustain power, to consolidate power in the Soviet Union, to get the country out of the huge economic predicament that it was in after the Civil War, right? Completely throwing Marxist-Leninism out the window for very practical reasons. Same happened with Deng Xiaoping, of course, essentially embracing a version of capitalism, but never abandoning the formal ideology of Marxist-Leninism. And the same happens with democratic leaders, right? In fact, even more so, they have to abandon ideology to make things happen, to compromise with opposition forces, et cetera. It's just natural.
I mean, a part, and I promise it's the last thing I'll say because we have to open this up for discussion. But part of the problem when we deal with issues like ideology is how do we define this anyway? It's very difficult. Those are really slippery concepts. As you know, my book has been criticized extensively on the account of my skeptical attitude towards ideology. And I think one of the reasons I think we're so skeptical about ideology, I think part of it comes from the experience, the lived experience. And I always find it really funny that we were born in the same year, and both we both emerged from the ruins of the Soviet system, effectively. And when you lived in that society, you know that people don't really.
But also, if you've actually studied Marxist-Leninism, God help you, like, I don't know anyone who has, like, actually studied the theory of it that actually believes it, right?
Yeah.
It's just complete horseshit. I'm sorry.
Well, but you've got, I mean, look. So I don't know. But back to definitions is extremely slippery, and people say, well, no, it's ideology. Oh no, it's not ideology. When you actually drive down to what they mean, it turns out that it's completely, it's different things. I was recently working on this in connection with a review that I have to write, a response to a review about my book. People criticized me for dismissing ideology. I said, well, what the hell do you mean by that? There's actually a book about ideology called Ideology in Introduction, which was 16 definitions of ideology, which, you can, sometimes it's used in a kind of, in the sense of, our enemies have ideology, but not us, because, ideology is seen as something negative connotation. Only those guys have ideology. Sometimes it's,
Yeah, and by the way, as anyone who has had political beliefs that were formed, in the early days, almost certainly those political beliefs have changed as you've grown up and experienced different life decisions and experiences, right? So why wouldn't that happen with leaders as well?
That's right.
They're just human.
Shifting. Yeah. No, that's right. I don't know. I mean, that certainly is true of me. I've shifted my personal beliefs have shifted from left to right over my lifetime. I think it's a normal thing.
Well, Churchill famously said, right? If you're not liberal when you're young, but yeah.
That's right. Anyway, look, let's open this up. I think I've already treaded into dangerous territory here. Questions?
Hi, can you hear me? So my name is Giulio, and I have a question about your definition of Cold War II. So I think a defining aspect of the Cold War was that it stayed cold, so no major confrontation between US and Soviet Union in their own land, so the proxy wars, etc. So what does it make this one a Cold War II and not just a rising challenger versus status quo power? So why Cold War II and not, I don't know, UK versus Germany with 21st century characteristics?
Great question. Well, and you could argue that the rise of Germany in the late 1800s was a period of Cold War between Great Britain and Germany until it became a hot war. And there were times, particularly in the 1960s, when this Cold War was on the precipice of going hot, right? Obviously, people remember the Cuban Missile Crisis that, again, Sergei in his book has written a terrific new analysis of. But as I write in my book, the almost forgotten West Berlin crisis a year early of 1961, which, by the way, was not just 1961, but really from the Berlin airlift in the 1940s through the 1950s. West Berlin was that point where American tanks were facing Russian tanks, right? There was ongoing threats, particularly in the late 1940s, from Khrushchev to push first Eisenhower, then Kennedy, to pull Allied troops out of West Berlin. And as I write in my book, that whole summer of 1961, right? The year began with Kennedy coming into office, launching the ruinous invasion of the Bay of Pigs, getting chastised by that, and wanting a better relationship with the Soviet Union. He wanted it at the time, a decade before Nixon did. He goes into the meeting with Khrushchev in Vienna. He writes him a letter first asking for the meeting that basically says there's no reason why our two countries can't come to some sort of understanding. We both have fought in World War II. We know how ruinous it can be. Let's move past it. And he goes into the meeting with Vienna and gets shocked that Khrushchev wants none of that, that the only issue he cares about is West Berlin and pushing the Americans and the Allied forces out of West Berlin, and basically threatened Kennedy that if you don't do this, I'm going in, right? And Kennedy becomes convinced that we're going to war. He goes on American television that summer and says, prepare for nuclear conflict, right? He asks Congress for authorization to build fallout shelters around the country. And only on August 12 of 1961, when he's woken up and is told that the East Germans are building the wall, does he sigh in relief. In relief, right? 25 years later, another president says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Kennedy says, thank God. If he's building the wall, he's not invading. The risk of conflict has just diminished dramatically. And I argue, and I think Sergei agrees, that the Berlin Wall, as terrible as it was for these Germans, actually contributed to the ability to get to détente in the 1970s because it stabilized the Cold War and reduced dramatically the risk of conflict. Well, Taiwan is the new West Berlin. That if you remove Taiwan from the equation, and China was not intent on invading Taiwan, and America, I believe, intent on preventing that, you would still have a Cold War, but it would be a Cold War that where the risk of a hot conflict would be dramatically diminished, because there's no other place where the United States and China would actually risk fighting a war. They wouldn't do it over some rocks in South China Sea or East China Sea or anywhere else. Taiwan is that one place, right? And that's why this moment is so dangerous, not akin to, not unlike 1961.
Thank you very much for your interesting insights. I have two questions. Am I allowed to ask both? They're both kind of different. The first one is, what do you see is like China's vision for the world? Like with every, great power or empire, they've always had it, like even today, they've always had like this vision of what the world order looks like. So for, Putin, it's Ruski Mir, restored Russian Empire. For Nazi Germany, it was Greater Germanic Reich, extending across all of Europe. What is China's equivalent of that? And the second one is with, an increased competition with China, my personal concern is how do we, I guess, remove the ethnic nationalist component about it, or at least the potential risk for one? Because, when I think of confrontation with China, I don't only just think about the US's confrontation with the Soviet Union. I think about the US's confrontation with Imperial Japan, and that ended up with Japanese American citizens ending up in internment camps, and Imperial Japan basically turning into an ultra-nationalist like fascist dictatorship that thinks that America is launching a race war against them and all the horrible consequences that ensue from that.
Okay, well, I would challenge you on Japan becoming fascist because of internments of Japanese Americans. That predated it, yes.
But the thing is, when you see that Japanese American confrontation, the ethnic national component would lead to these two outcomes separate.
Yeah.
Not like, yeah.
So vision for the world. I actually don't think that any country is all that different. Most countries, particularly that have the resources to be incredibly powerful countries, want to be number one, right? It's a human reaction. If you're in a race, you want to win it. It's just natural. I don't care if you're Chinese, Russian, American, French, doesn't matter. Like the French think that they're a great power. One can quibble with that, but Macron and the Gaullist vision of France certainly views them as sitting at the table, being more or less equal to the Americans or the Chinese, right? the Russians certainly have those ambitions as well. I think in part the drive of the Russian people to support Putin and to ultimately get him elected is to restore that greatness that they felt that they lost, in their view, unfairly with the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? So China wants to be number one. Again, it's not unnatural. It's not unique to them. We want to be number one as Americans. And I think that is their vision for the world, is to be the preeminent superpower. And by the way, they have a great historical case for that, because through almost entire human history, they were the most powerful, richest country on the planet, most populous, right? It's only up until the Industrial Revolution that they lost that mantle to first Great Britain, then America. And they would say because of the Opium Wars and the century of humiliation with unfair treaties and everything else. And they think that this is their rightful place to reemerge on the world stage and do that. By the way, India has a vision to become the world's greatest country, right? So this is not unique to any particular country or any particular leader. What they do once they become number one, I think that's where things might change. America has certainly made its share of mistakes, including in recent decades, but more or less has been a fairly benevolent, not completely benevolent, but fairly benevolent country on the world stage. Others may be less so. And even America, when it became the unipolar world, that's where we got into a lot of the excesses of invasions of other countries, et cetera, right? So I think it's always dangerous to have a country, particularly an authoritarian country with a cult of personality leadership, to have that much power. And even when you have democratic countries, you've seen excesses. When you have authoritarian countries, those excesses become even greater. On the racial front, absolutely, you can't have Chinese Americans being or any Asian Americans or in other countries being racially profiled because of this conflict. We have to appreciate that they are, in many ways, our greatest strength in showing the Chinese people that there's another way to go about this. Taiwan is not just an incredible nation that has achieved huge successes economically, democratically, et cetera, but it is effectively rival China, right? That shows a way that China could be different. So it's not about ethnically profiling them. It's about really confronting the CCP and its ambitions.
So can I follow up in the spirit of contradicting you, because I
Sure.
like doing that. So on the question, you mentioned the French, and the question for me is, well, how is it the French seem to be quite? You may say they're not trying to run the world. They have
They'd like to.
They have a certain sense of grandeur, but I mean, it's not like they're trying to overthrow the United States or something like that. So what accounts for this difference? Is it that the French are resigned to their secondary role, or are they happy with their place in the international order? And else, the other thing. So, do you want to?
Yeah,
answer?
well, first of all, not to go down the rabbit hole, but the French are famous for trying to put sticks into the wheels of American foreign
Sure, but
policy.
it's not like they're trying to kind of, say, okay, we're going to run the world or something like that.
Well, I think there are ambitions to be a global power. Again, those ambitions are curtailed by your economic reality, your military realities, et cetera. I think every country would love to be number one in the world. Most countries are realistic about their potential, human potential, economic potential, military potential, and they're not pursuing that.
They have the bomb. They have lots of stuff.
Yeah.
But okay, so the other question is about China. I'll tell you what I was doing this morning. This morning, I was watching the Trump rally in New York. And you say, how can you do that? And that's, I was actually reading Jean-Paul Sartre, Being and Nothingness, but then I got distracted by this rally, which I thought was
Such a
very
procrastinator.
It happens. But, it was very interesting for me anthropologically. But I noticed that at exactly 5 minutes into the rally, I mean, it didn't even hardly start. They started with, Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, there's a national anthem. 5 minutes into the rally, the woman who sang the national anthem at the rally already declared that America is the greatest country in the world. 5 minutes, right, of 6 hours. If you look at the Chinese rhetoric, they never say that. Like, if you read Xi Jinping's speeches, he never says China is the greatest country in the world. So why is there this rhetorical, doesn't that rhetorical difference suggest that the Chinese do not have this ambitions? Or would you look for evidence elsewhere, not in the rhetoric, but elsewhere?
Well, I do think that Americans are very messianic in their pursuit of, being the shiniest city on the hill, and the belief that we are the force for good in the world. I think that is a unique aspect of American culture that most other countries don't share. So I think with China, it's not about being the greatest country in the world, it's about being the most powerful and most economically prosperous. And that clearly is an ambition both of Xi Jinping, but frankly of everyone in the Chinese Communist Party and everyone in China, right? It's an ambition of Putin, it's an ambition of many Russian people. So that's what I'm talking about. It's not about being the greatest. That I think that might be a uniquely American thing.
I wonder, because there's a difference, of course, between rhetoric and acting on rhetoric or acting in general. But you do think that, for example, in the Russian context, if, let's say, Putin had a rally and said, Россия величайшая страна. Maybe he does say that now. I don't know. Россия величайшая страна в мире. It almost sounds like if he said some, people would say, "Oh my God, he's crazy."
Well, I think he realizes. I mean, he's not delusional. I don't think. In fact, this argument that he's irrational by launching the war in Ukraine, I don't think he was irrational at all. I think he made a rational decision that backfired on him, miscalculated. But he appreciates that Russia is not the most powerful country. Certainly economically, its GDP is the size of Italy. It knows that militarily.
He claims it's number 4, by the way. He always claims it's number 4 in the world.
Okay, but not number 1.
Yeah, he says it's by PPP. He always says PPP.
Yeah. But he knows it's not number 1. So there is reality that sets in on leaders that as much as you would like for something to happen, at least in the near term, it's not going to happen. So you have to make do with what you got.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. My name's Ben. I just wanted to ask about a potentially controversial proposition of preparing Taiwan for a peaceful reunification with China, given China's 100-year goal of uniting the mainland and at the same time de-risking its supply chains from Taiwan, so that potential reunification doesn't cause too much harm. Just what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll challenge you on your phrasing, because that's the CCP propaganda, reunification. As I write in the book, Taiwan never belonged to China. That is a falsehood that the CCP is promoting. Taiwan, first of all, indigenous people in Taiwan are not even Han Chinese, right? They're Micronesians. The last 400 years of Taiwanese history is littered with examples of colonialists trying to take over that country. It started with the Dutch, continued with the Spanish, continued with the Chinese. All of them were failures, effectively. They were able to get partial emplacements on the island, but never fully controlled it. In fact, when I was launching this book, I don't know if I told you the story, I was launching it at this famous bookstore in DC, Politics and Prose, where I was being interviewed by Jim Sciutto. And after the interview finished, we took audience questions, and this woman came up to the microphone and introduced herself as the first secretary from the Chinese embassy. And she railed into me of how Taiwan always belonged to China and so forth. And I said, I'm going to stop you right there and give you a little bit of a history lesson that you probably did not learn in your Chinese Communist Party upbringing. And it's about an event that occurred in 1867 when an American merchant marine ship called Rover shipwrecks on the island of Taiwan, and the disembarking party that tries to land on the island gets slaughtered by the native tribesmen. And as you might expect, the American government files a formal complaint to ostensibly the government that controls Taiwan, which at the time on paper is China and the Emperor of China. And they get back an official response saying, we don't control these savages. You're welcome to do whatever you want with them. And we authorize pretty much any punitive measures you're interested in undertaking. And in fact, when the Japanese finally managed to conquer Taiwan in 1895, it was for much of the same reasons, that they were encountering these warrior tribes on the island, and finally had enough of it. And that was the first time in 1895 when anyone fully controlled Taiwan. It was Japan. They, of course, held it until 1945, when it was given to Chiang Kai-shek by the Allies. But at that point, Chiang Kai-shek was no longer the ruler of China. He was losing territory steadily to Mao until, 4 years later, he had to flee to Taiwan. So there is no reunification. There is only unification by force that I believe is the only way that this gets accomplished. There's something, I think, fundamentally wrong about taking a nation that never belonged to another nation and telling them, well, you just have to accept it, right? We don't do that with Ukraine. I don't know why we would do that with Taiwan. And the Taiwanese people have zero interest in this. Like, this is not going to happen voluntarily, because particularly in the last 30 years, since the development of democracy on the island, there's been a keen interest in their own history, which is apart from the Chinese history, interest in indigenous populations, their language, their food culture, etc. And the opinion polls now show that at most 7% of the Taiwanese have any interest in unification whatsoever at some undetermined point in the future, and only 1% wants it today, right? That's like within the margin of error, basically zero. So these are people that don't want to unify, and pushing them into that position by force, I don't think is humane or frankly in the interest of the United States. Secondly, on diversification of supply chains, not going to happen. You've probably heard about the Chips and Science Act that was passed by Congress in 2022 to invest in fab manufacturing in the U.S. $75 billion with subsidies and tax breaks to industry, including Taiwanese companies like TSMC, to produce in the U.S. A drop in the bucket compared to what is needed to actually eliminate dependence on Taiwan. Taiwan produces 90% of all advanced chips, 40% of all chips. You will need 100 times that investment to even think about building that outside of Taiwan. Not going to happen in the next 10 years, not going to happen probably in the next 20 years. So that's just not the reality.
Hi, thanks for coming. My name's Leo. I think from what you said, you've done a good job showing that there are similarities between the set of circumstances that the U.S. and China are in, and that's similar to the Cold War. But I'm just sort of I guess wondering what is the purpose of invoking the imaginary of the Cold War? I mean, I guess it sort of invites the follow-up. If it's a Cold War, well, then we should treat it like one. And I guess I'm just asking, what about the set of circumstances that you've identified and labeled as similar to the Cold War means? How does that mean that we should act a certain way?
Well, if you're in a Cold War or any war, then presumably the objective is to win it, right? So, the most of the book is actually the strategy for how you win versus arguing about the semantics. But I do think semantics are important. And this is probably the best argument that is used against my argument that we're in a Cold War, and often comes from administration officials or former administration officials that basically concede that it is a Cold War, but we shouldn't call it that, primarily because it will alienate other countries that don't want to see a Cold War and don't want to choose. And my response to that is, well, by the way, this is no different from the first Cold War, where you had this whole non-aligned world, which, by the way, was most of the world that didn't want to choose between, the first world and the second world, right, with the Soviet Union. And by the way, many of the same countries that are saying they don't want to choose now were part of that non-aligned world. It was India, it was Indonesia, it was, what we call now as Global South, was that non-aligned world. So that argument I don't find convincing. But the main argument that I have for why we should call a spade is for domestic reasons. that you have to convince the American public that this is not just a competition, as the administration calls it. Because if it's a competition, that's if it's some sort of marathon race, well, who cares if China wins, right? I mean, you want to win races, but like if you lose one or two, who cares, right? We just had the Olympics in Paris, and the Chinese almost eclipsed us in the number of gold medals. We pulled out on the very last day, but if we had lost, like, would anyone care beyond a day? Probably not. Right? But this is different because this is not a competition. This is a rivalry, and I believe a Cold War rivalry that you can't afford to lose. And you have to let the American people know what the stakes are and why they should undertake certain measures that I argue about we should do in the book that will be painful for us to do. Economically painful, painful in terms of the priorities that we have to invest in, both military and otherwise, in our country. And that is why, to marshal that type of support, political support, you have to tell them why it's worth it and why this is not just a competition.
Do you think, so you have, okay, yeah. I was just going to follow up on this because I find it extremely interesting, but go ahead.
Thanks so much for the very interesting presentation. My name's Sean. I just wanted to quickly ask, I think you kind of touched on it with the 2 answers ago, but recently TSMC has opened a pretty productive fabrication facility in Arizona, and NVIDIA plans to open one in Mexico. Do you think that this further incentivizes China to invade Taiwan, or doesn't, or has kind of no effect at all? Thanks.
Look, I think the causes for Xi Jinping to invade Taiwan are basically those human factors that I mentioned. This is not a man that's deeply interested in economics. I don't think he's lusting after Taiwan because of chips. By the way, like, Taiwan started developing semiconductors in the 1980s. China has had ambitions to take Taiwan, predating that, right? Going back to Mao. So this was never about chips. And I think Xi Jinping is convinced, I think wrongly, but he's convinced that if given enough time, his own industry will catch up and he won't need Taiwan. And I don't think the chips are playing a big role in this for him.
You know what's weird, and that's a slight aside. If you go back to the Qing Dynasty, China was actually, China was a huge empire which included parts of Russia, Mongolia, etc. But it doesn't seem that Beijing sees it as absolutely crucial to, or CCP sees it as crucial to its survival to, let's say, invade and reunify with Mongolia, never mind with parts of Russia. But Taiwan has acquired this strange symbolic significance. I wonder why this is. I mean, for Putin, Ukraine, you can understand because there's this Kiev and Rus, there's this historical narrative that you can plausibly link the origins of Russia to Ukraine. You can actually plausibly do that. In China's case, origins of China do not link to Taiwan. It's a different story.
Well, and more than that, in 1937, Mao was quoted saying to an American journalist that we don't actually care about Taiwan. That this preoccupation with Taiwan is actually very, very recent because there is no long history of occupation of Taiwan, but because this is effectively unfinished civil war, right? That Chiang Kai-shek and his Nationalist Party was never defeated. They were able to flee and establish a rival China, which, by the way, for the first 20 years was recognized as the China, right? They had the UN Security Council seat. They were recognized by both America and many in the Western world as the China until the early 1970s. And that created a political impetus to extinguish them and to conquer them as a way to put a final nail in the coffin of the Chinese Civil War and to claim that we finally won, right? And that's what I think is driving Xi as well, because when he thinks about his own legacy and his place in the pantheon of Chinese history, I believe he wants to be known as someone who's greater than Mao, right? And the way to do that is to do one thing that Mao could never do, which is take Taiwan and achieve the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation.
Other questions? Yep.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question on Cold War II and economics factor. The thing that puzzle a little bit me about is the following one. China is a modern hyper-investment and overproduction. And nowadays, we see the limit of that model. So the frontier of profitable investment is shrinking, but the economy is not moving toward more consumption, it's simply doubling down on investment. So the question is that if you have this model, you want to enter in a Cold War II, well, how can this is possible? It says you should change your economic model because you really now rely too much on export. And if you go to the decoupling or splitting the war, this model, you cannot export so much to Cambodia or Vietnam. So where is it going?
It's a great question. And this actually goes into my argument that not only is this Cold War very similar to the first one, but that one difference is that China is actually much, much weaker than the Soviet Union ever was, right? Militarily, it's unquestionably weaker. Landmass, it's a much smaller landmass. Geopolitically, it's basically contained within South China Sea and East China Sea in a way that the Soviet Union never was. And the one place where it's better is on the economy, but that economic foundation is fundamentally weak because it depends on the rest of the world. We've effectively subsidized China for the last 40 years by well, subsidize is the wrong word, but invested in them. Well, we've invested and we've bought their cheap goods, right? Subsidization was the wrong word. And that created a model that is absolutely weak because they don't have the natural resources to be self-sustaining in the means of production. They're highly dependent on imports and they're highly dependent on exports for their economic growth, which is now coming undone with the trade wars that are being launched and protectionist measures, not just in the West, but everywhere, right? It's interesting when you look at the countries that are instituting tariffs against Chinese EVs, it's not just the usual suspect of America and Europe, it's Turkey, it's Brazil, it's India, it's all these BRICS countries that we're told are in alliance with China that are suddenly saying, wait a second, we don't want our domestic industries getting destroyed by your overcapacity, we're pushing back. And the other problem that they have is that they have a leader in Xi Jinping that is completely uninterested and I think completely doesn't understand economics and is unwilling to change that model. And even when you look at their haphazard ways of trying to reinvigorate growth with stimulus packages, they're never sufficient. And he was resisting it for so long, I think in part because of his own background in the Cultural Revolution, where he was saying, wait a second, I was eating weeds and doing hard labor, and you guys are complaining that you're sitting on the couch without a job. Like, get over yourself, right? It's actually quite ironic that the guy that's a Marxist-Leninist is actually against socialist policies for economic growth. But because of his pursuit of power, and because he is consolidated power in the Politburo and within the rest of the Communist Party by pushing out all these bureaucrats that actually understood economics. And if you go talk to any economist in China within the leadership position in the last 5 years, all they want to talk to you about is their grandchildren and how they're going to enjoy your retirement, because the last thing they want to do is remain in power and risk getting cut up in the anti-corruption campaign and the purges that he's instituting. So he's driven everyone that understands how to manage economy out of the government and is now having fundamental problems that are very difficult to solve for anyone, and certainly not a government that lacks expertise.
So we started, and I think that we should leave close up with this. But we started our conversation with a discussion whether we are in the Cold War. It seems that you think we are in the Cold War with China. Then does that mean that we are in a state of effectively inevitable confrontation? It doesn't matter what happens in Washington on November 5th, this is going to continue. Is that your view of it?
Well, it's not just my view. I think it's a fact, right? Both candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, talk about competing with China and talk about, Kamala Harris actually used my phrase, we need to beat China in the race for the 21st century at their nomination speech. I'm not sure if she's read the book, but I'm happy to give her a signed copy if she wants to, if she wants it. But we're not going back. I had a conversation with a CEO of a Fortune 100 company about a year into Biden's term. And this person told me, when Biden got elected, I thought that we would finally go back to the good old days of engagement with China, that this period of trade wars would be past us. And a year in, I realized that that's not happening as Biden is instituting more export controls, tightening up restrictions on investments, and ultimately instituted even more tariffs on China. Industry, and I think the rest of the world is realizing there's no going back, that as divided as Washington is, there's one thing that unites them, and that's China. Both political parties believe that we're in a confrontational rivalry with China, even if they may not all call it a Cold War, and we need to win it. So I don't think that this is ever going back. This genie is ever going back in the bottle. And by the way, the one person we have to thank for all of this is Xi Jinping, because he is the one that woke us up to the threat of China. If we had a Hu Jintao type of leader right now in China that is, not so secretly even, building up Chinese military, building up Chinese independence, but without the confrontation measures that they're engaging in South China Sea against the Filipinos or Vietnamese fishermen, or certainly surrounding Taiwan, without the wolf warrior diplomacy, without this aggression that you've seen from Xi Jinping's administration since he came into office in 2012, we might still be complacent about this threat, right? He ignored Deng Xiaoping's maxim of hide your strength, bide your time, and turned it into basically show off your strength and waste no time. And that has been the greatest gift to the West, that the mask has come off and we understand the nature of the regime we're dealing with.
Right. Well, I think that's a perfect place to end. I think we've had a wide-ranging discussion. Thank you all for coming. And would you please join me in thanking our speaker, DMITRI ALPEROVITCH. And we have the book now in the library, a signed copy.